Hi everyone, this is Shelby with In. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. I just wanted to make sure that the sound was working. So you should have a little chat box. If you could just type in the chat to let me know whether you see the PowerPoint slides and whether you can hear me. That'd be great. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. This is my first time doing a webinar on Zoom, just myself. I did one last month with UNC, so hopefully it's all going to be great, but thank you so much for commenting back. Okay, I am going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. This is Shelby. Again, I'm with the Colorado Initiative for Inclusive Higher Education. I manage our outreach and education program, which really just provides different trainings and resources around college access for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I'll do a little more background later on kind of our organization um, and what we do, and then what inclusive higher education looks like. This webinar will be recorded. So at the end, I think it takes like a couple hours for Zoom to process it, but at some point today or tomorrow, I'll send you out the recording, and then I'll also send you a copy of the slides. So if you are sitting there taking notes frantically and you're like, I can't get it all down, don't worry. The text is on the slides so that I can send it out to you later on. A couple different housekeeping things. There is a chat box. I have it set up on my screen so I can see your questions, and I'll kind of monitor that as we go. If it seems like your question is really pertinent right now, I'll try to address it. Otherwise, I'm going to leave some time at the end just for kind of general questions. And then I have it set up so I think everyone's microphone is muted. I just do that so there's not a lot of echo. So if you could just keep your microphone muted, that's really helpful just for the sound. Okay. And then if you have any problems hearing me or the slides aren't progressing, any technical things, again, you can put those in the comment box and I should be able to see that. So again, welcome to the webinar. Here we go. So IN, that's kind of our short name, like IN exclamation mark. We were founded in 2014, really by a group of parents who had students who wanted to go to college and were maybe being told they couldn't go to college. Some were enrolling at community colleges and maybe taking one class at a time. Some might not have been successful with that. And so they kind of looked around and said, what's happening in other states? We know that 40 some other states have options for students with intellectual disabilities to go on to higher education. How can we make that happen in Colorado? And so our mission is really to create inclusive college opportunities in our state for students with intellectual disabilities to foster academic growth, social development, and career advancement. Our organization doesn't do the direct service. Instead, we advocate with universities and colleges to choose to offer the sort of model we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start by going into kind of the history of what does this look like in higher education just for students with disabilities in general, and how does inclusion of students with intellectual disabilities play into that? Then I'm going to get into more about just an overview of what inclusive higher education is, and then I'll get into more of the nitty gritty about what it looks like in Colorado. Everyone always is waiting for that financial info. And then I'll wrap up with just some tips on kind of preparing for college. So, what we'll hear a lot with students with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities, is that graduation is kind of like falling off a cliff. You've received a lot of services until the age of 21, and now you're looking at what's next. And a lot of students aren't sure what's next. And so we kind of look at college as a way to address that issue, saying, here is additional time to really work on some of those job skills and really figure out what sort of career you would like for the rest of your life. Many students, might transition from public schools into having, maybe they're at home with mom and dad, or maybe they're working a community job, but maybe they're not around other people. And so sometimes too, you'll hear that folks spend a lot of time on the couch. And so really, we're looking at college as a way to kind of not go into another cliff, but to help bridge the transition into adulthood and into that career of the individual's choice. Some of the barriers to college, and again, we're really talking about students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are things like perception of student ability. So maybe a teacher who doesn't believe that the student would be successful in college. Things like standardized testing. So when we talk about the SAT or the ACT, some of our students maybe aren't taking those tests. Some students, maybe they've tried them and their score wouldn't be the level required to be admitted to a university. There's also the lack of adequate supports in many cases. A lot of times on a college campus, there's that academic support, but what happens if there's not social support or vocational support for a student? Another big barrier when it comes to college is accommodations versus modifications. In K to 12, you're going to get both accommodations and modifications. But when you transition to college, you can only receive accommodations. And so that historically has been a big challenge for students who have been accessing those modifications and now find themselves on a college campus where those aren't in place. And I'll talk more about kind of the difference between those on the college campus later on. Other challenges are things like funding. So, how does a university fund having additional supports for individuals with disabilities on campus if those supports go beyond kind of the basic Americans with Disabilities Act requirement? The perception of the institution can be another challenge and barrier for students. So, sometimes institutions might not have as many supports for students with disabilities due to some sort of philosophy that they have at that institution. Everyone is kind of different, and I think there's where you see big differences between community colleges that are open access where anyone can enroll, and then universities that have those more strict policies for admission that require certain high school classes, certain testing, certain GPA, maybe engagement in extracurriculars, so on and so forth. And then student preparedness is one that I talk about often in my job, is just looking at how are we preparing students to be ready for college and having greater independence, maybe moving away from home. Along with this, kind of in general, is just lack of knowledge of what college options are out there. And so I'm hoping in this webinar, you'll just get a sense of what can it look like for a student with an intellectual disability who wants to go to college and who has a career goal that's in alignment with going to college. Um, and Just as I keep saying college, just know that that includes community colleges as well as universities. I'll talk about specific schools later, but college is just kind of my term for overall higher education. Another part of inclusive higher education, and I think where a lot of this originally came from, is we've seen a lot of progress towards inclusion in general and having different diversity represented on college campuses. So you'll see, a push for racial diversity and cultural diversity. There's a lot going on around sexual orientation on college campuses, talking about physical ability and just all of these different kind of movements for diversity on a college campus. But the group that historically hadn't really been represented are those students, again, with intellectual disabilities who are using some of those modifications and who haven't traditionally been on college campuses because they haven't been admitted. This slide is showing kind of three different columns to explain the differences between services for students with disabilities on a college campus. Originally, there's disability services. This really came kind of in the 1970s and 80s. It is legally mandated all schools will have a disability service office. Some of those offices are called your student access service. Some might be called student achievement. Some might be the Office of Disability Service. So it might have a different name, but it is an office on campus where students can go after they've been accepted, talk to someone there about their disability and what accommodations they might need. That person then is going to work with the student and their professors to make sure they get some of those accommodations in place. What's important to know with disability service is it falls under specific legislation, so your Americans with Disabilities Act and the 504 Rehabilitation Act. And it's a different section. And so for college, they have reasonable accommodations, whereas for K to 12, it's just accommodations. So sometimes, even if a student received an accommodation in K to 12, that accommodation might not be available with disability service. And for a while, disability service really, it does serve students in some capacities. So especially students who maybe previously there wasn't access for students with wheelchairs. And so we really saw a push in the late 1900s for kind of wheelchair accessibility, having curb cuts on campus, having elevators on campus, having access to classrooms that are accessible. We also see, accessibility as it relates to students who are blind or students who are deaf, having some of those interpretation services or having textbooks in Braille. So different things going on for those accommodations, especially for students who have some sort of kind of physical impairment. We don't see as much in terms of support for students who, again, have those additional needs around maybe social engagement or vocational engagement. They've got disability service. Then, with this comprehensive service, they're really looking at serving students who have various disabilities. Oftentimes, you might see students with traumatic brain injury. Again, students with autism often fall here. These are students who have been traditionally accepted, but maybe they need to meet with someone weekly to talk about organization or different executive functioning skills that help with success. Maybe they need someone to help with navigation through roommate challenges or finding a job, keeping a job, all different supports that your disability service office isn't necessarily addressing. And then the last one that's much more recent and really came out of the 2008 reauthorization of the Higher Education Opportunity Act is inclusive services. This is really looking at students who have not traditionally been accepted. So maybe they don't have the traditional high school diploma. Maybe they haven't taken the prerequisite classes. Maybe they don't have the SAT or ACT or the GPA. Whatever you kind of think of as like, what is that barrier to entry? Inclusive services is saying we are going to make alternate pathways to enrollment so that students are not just not accepted, but that they have a pathway to enroll if higher education is what their interest is. With inclusive services, students can receive accommodations and modifications, and that's really the crux. So if you're thinking what student might be best suited for inclusive service, it's really your student who needs those modifications to be successful. Sometimes a student might have some modifications, but maybe they don't necessarily need them. And so they might fall more under comprehensive service, where they might be okay without them, But for our students using an inclusive service, they're really using those modifications. And then again, they have those support needs in various domains. And I'll talk later about what that looks like. So, again, if you have questions as we're going through this, the chat box is open. I can see it and kind of monitor it. But hopefully, this is making sense. And just to say, there are different places that students might fall. And again, disability service isn't necessarily bad. It's just that sometimes that support is not sufficient for some of our students. When we look at why students with intellectual disabilities might go on to higher education, sometimes I think folks think, well, that's great. They can go have a college experience, but are they going to gain anything from it? And the answer is most definitely yes. Colorado will see our first graduates this year, so we don't have the data on what happens afterwards. But because this has been around longer in other states, we do know what some of those impacts are. So, for example, students can expect to experience an increase in wages, just like any other student that's gone on for higher education. Students with intellectual disabilities who have gone on to post-secondary education average a 102% increase in wages. They also see an increase in job diversity with a decrease in industries like food preparation and cleaning and maintenance. I think a lot of that is attributed to you have so many different things that you can study on a college campus. And so it really does help open up those doors to different careers. The healthcare profession is one that they've seen nationally, with a lot of students with intellectual disability having more access to those careers. Students also report having more social relationships and more people their own age, as well as more people that they can help, so that they're not only receiving help, but they're also contributing to some of those relationships. And the last piece that me, for a sibling, is always excited about is that students with intellectual disability who have gone on to college are more likely to live on their own and rent their own home. And they're much less likely to live with mom and dad or in a group home. So I always think that's really cool to look at what is the impact on independence as well. We can talk a lot about those career impacts, but it's important to know that, those social relationships and some of that other independence that you would expect for any other college student is what we're seeing. If you're someone that really loves data and wants to know more about some of these outcomes, Think College, which you'll see kind of listed at the bottom of the slide, is the National Coordinating Center for Inclusive Higher Education, and they do a lot of research around this topic. So I've put together a diagram here just explaining how our organization is related to other entities in our state. All of our inclusive higher education that we're going to talk about really came out of a Senate bill that was passed in 2016 that provided funding to 3 schools to start inclusive higher education pathways. Those schools each have their own inclusive office on campus that's run by the school itself. So for example, we have University of Northern Colorado. Their office is called GOAL, GOAL. So it's like go on and learn. There's Arapahoe Community College at their Littleton campus has an office called Elevate. And then at University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, they have an office called the Office of Inclusive Services. Those are the offices doing the direct work with students. Students would apply directly to those services, to those service offices, and then they become a fully matriculated student when they're accepted. And I'll talk about what it looks like once they're on campus in a few more slides. But just know, schools do all of the work with students. As the nonprofit, we do more on the side of awareness, letting people know what's possible for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and really trying to raise the expectations in our society for, having the opportunity to go to college and having that chance to follow your dreams if that's what a student's interested in. We also do fundraising and provide some additional funding to the schools as they are still in their initial years. And then we do a lot of different trainings. I talked about that a little earlier, but I'll go out to like resource fairs. I might meet with teachers, go to conferences, just again, raising awareness that these options exist. Even though this is the 4th year they've been around, there's still a lot of families who really have no idea what this is, what the impact is, that it even exists and is an option for their student. And the last entity I have is JFK Partners, who does an evaluation each year. And if you're really interested in that, you can find it on our website. Now I'm going to go more into the overview of what inclusive higher education looks like for students. So there are four main pillars for the model we have in Colorado, those being academics, social, career, and independence. This is really focusing on collaboration between different entities, looking at what is normative when you look at other college students. An example of this would be in some states, inclusive higher education pathways are only 1 year at a university, but the majority of students go for 4 years. So in our state, our universities have 4-year models. We also look again at that evaluation piece to make sure students are receiving services, get some feedback on what families think, what do professors think, what do students think, what do staff on campus think, so on and so forth. And then each of these entities, I'm going to go in a little more depth about what those supports look like. So for the academic piece, students have access to the full course catalog. Sometimes I might hear that folks think kind of classes are pre-modified or students can only pick certain classes. It is really looking at what does this college offer? What is the student interested in doing? Students are usually taking 2 classes per semester from that course catalog. Sometimes students might take 3, but I'd say usually the first year 2 is a pretty good amount. Your traditional college student might take 4 or 5 classes, but really we found that's a lot for students with intellectual disability. And they also have one specialized class. That class, so like at UNC, it's called the Goal class. Each semester it's slightly different, and it's really looking at some of those job skills that students might need. They're looking at kind of how you use public transit, talking about social relationships, resume development, going to interviews, reading your taxes, budgeting, just all those different skills that college students might be gaining, that students with intellectual disabilities might need some additional kind of teaching in that domain. Students are receiving a comprehensive higher education certificate upon completion. I'll have a picture of that in a slide or two. I think that's really important to highlight is that students are taking classes for credit towards a certificate that is awarded by their Institute of Higher Education. So if you're going to UCCS, you receive a certificate from UCCS. That's kind of part of making it more normative. Because students are using modifications, their credit does not count towards a bachelor's degree. So I always like to be very clear about this, that if a student could take classes without modification and work towards an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, that's really what we would encourage. For these pathways, we are really talking about students who would not traditionally be accepted and who would not be on that pathway towards an associate's or a bachelor's. Again, if that's not making sense and you have a question, feel free to comment in that chat box. And the classes are graded. This is another kind of myth that I've heard that floats around there is that students do not receive a grade and classes are pass-fail. It's possible a student does take a pass-fail class just like anyone else. So I got my degree in education. Some of my classes were pass-fail. I kind of wrote some reflections about my experiences in the field, and then passed the class. But otherwise, students are being graded and with the rubric used for other students. For the supports in place for the academic component, students are using accommodations and modifications. Peer mentors play a big role here. They might lead a study hall. They might help students with tracking assignments. There's also course advising that goes on. In each inclusive office, there's kind of one academic staff person, and that's the person who is going to collaborate with professors on what accommodations and modifications might be appropriate for a student that they have in their class. And they're also going to do that course advising as to what makes sense for the student to take and what is going to help them progress towards the career goal that they have. And then students have access to any other support that any other student on campus can access. The tutoring center is a big one. The writing center is another. These are kind of the common academic support offices students might use. For the accommodations versus modifications, the accommodations students in college might have are things like extra time, using some assistive technology, so having a speech-to-text device is a common one. Maybe students have preferential seating at the front of the classroom or in an area where it's easy to take frequent breaks. Maybe it's somewhere where there's fewer distractions. They might have a separate testing location. They might have extended time. Those are your accommodations that, again, any student with a disability who qualifies for disability services can access. The modifications are the piece that is specific to inclusive higher ed, and it's something that universities have to choose to offer, which is why you won't see these sorts of supports at every school. So with the modifications, I think the ones I'm most common with are things related to reading and writing. So students on these pathways might have an elementary level reading and writing, maybe middle school, maybe high school. It's really variable, but I just share that so you don't think my student still needs to achieve the high school level. That's not necessarily the case with these modifications in place. So sometimes a student might have a shortened reading assignment. Sometimes they have a reading assignment that's at a different grade level. Sometimes for a paper, instead of writing a 5-page paper, a student might complete a 1-page paper. Sometimes instead of a paper, maybe they're completing a graphic organizer that has all the components that are still required, but just looks slightly different. Maybe instead of a written final exam, they're completing a multiple choice exam. Maybe they have less options for what the correct answer might be. If everyone's doing a multiple choice with 4 options, maybe theirs has 2 or 3 options. So still demonstrating that they are learning in those classes, but it might be done in a slightly different way. In terms of what students in Colorado are studying, it's very broad ranging because again, it's up to the student. I've put together just a list of some of the examples. This is not exhaustive. There are 70 students across the 3 schools, and it kind of looks different at each school based on what's offered. So art design, American Sign Language, brewing studies, criminal justice, healthcare, human services, leadership, photojournalism, physical education. The list goes on and on as to what students might choose. This image is showing you what the certificate actually looks like. This one is for Arapahoe Community College. Theirs is 3 years. UNC and UCCS are 4 years. So it's showing under academic coursework, students are taking that 1 specialized class and then 2 courses from their area of interest. They're also doing a vocational piece, which will be in my next slides, but that is really a component that is a required piece of inclusive higher education. And you'll see that that's kind of why it's outlined on this certificate. So for the career piece, this is probably one of the biggest components of inclusive higher education. We have in year 1, students are often still acclimating to college, and they're doing a lot of exploration around what their area of interest is. This could look like doing career interest surveys, talking about career readiness. An example that I'll commonly use is a student comes to college and says, I'm really interested in being a counselor or a businessman. In college, really that can look like lots of things. So let's take business, for example. Business could be marketing. It could be more leadership. It could be finance. It could be, trying to start up your own company. There's a lot of different ways business can look. The same as counseling. You could be more of a social worker with substance use. You could be in a hospital setting. You could work with kids. You could have your own practice. Lots of different things. And so year 1 is really just looking at what makes sense, what is a student interested in. They might also do job shadows, job tours that year. Year 2 is often when students will have a job on campus. And that's often because students may have never had a job in the past. And so those jobs are really kind of looking at just getting those foundational job skills in place. In year 3, students will often have an internship in their area of interest. Some of these are paid, some are unpaid. It often relates to kind of what field. So for example, human services for college students, those are often unpaid internships, whereas other degrees or departments might have paid internships. Students also will often have a job over the summer with their home community to continue working on some of those skills. And then if a student needs, job coaching might be provided. Just like there's an academic coordinator in each inclusive office, there's also a career coordinator. During the 4th year then, students are really looking at off-campus employment within the local community and looking for a job placement that can lead into competitive integrated employment after they leave, which takes us then to that post-college, which is just really looking at that transition into having a stable career within the community. For different internship examples, some of those on-campus internships students have had are working in the rec center, working in the dining hall, the bookstore. There's a pie cafe at UNC that a couple students have worked in. Other students have had experiences with campus belief. There's another student who does campus tours at UCCS. And again, those internships, the point is really to gain some of those work skills in your first 1 and 2 years of college. For the off-campus examples, this is, again, not an exhaustive list, but just examples of where students have placements within the community. There's one student who's really interested in theater, so he's at the Community Arts Center. Another student pursued her certified nurse aide certification. It's kind of redundant, but so she's working within the healthcare field. Another student is with a therapeutic writing center. A couple students are really interested in early childhood education and are interning in preschool classrooms. Other students in a vet clinic, and others at a radio station. So really just looking at what is specific to where they want to work and what will that internship look like. For the social piece, students are involved in campus just like you would expect for any other student. Sometimes I think this is a piece that gets overlooked when we talk about college, is it really is about getting engaged on campus. Students might attend sporting events. They can join clubs just like anyone else. Volunteering is something some students are really interested in. There's different leadership roles students can have. Some of the examples I have are, there's a couple students at ACC who have they've been elected to student government. There's a couple students who have rushed for fraternities at UNC and have been accepted into those. And I think those are both kind of examples of where students might find some natural support on campus. That, now I have this fraternity, and I have all my brothers in the fraternity, and that offers a lot of additional support. There's a couple other students who are on club sports team like rugby and swim team, and they travel around the state to different competitions with their peers. Another student started her own knitting club that's been kind of successful. Other students really just love residential life. So it really varies, but I just want to kind of convey that, it is multiple pillars. There's the academics, there's the career, but then there's still being a college student and having that socialization on campus. For the majority of the social component, you still have a social coordinator through the inclusive office who can help make some of these connections and just grow awareness on campus. But a lot of this comes down to peer mentors. And those peer mentors are folks who might be paid, they might not be paid. Some study special education, some don't. Sometimes it's better if they don't, because then it's much more just a peer-to-peer and not so much a kind of teaching model. But again, they're just other college students who might go around with you on campus. So this is kind of how the social piece works. This is a big piece, I think, on the weekends or on weeknights. It's another piece for just kind of like going off campus, doing different activities, meeting different people on campus. Okay, and then the independence piece. This is where a lot of self-advocacy comes into play. For college students, oftentimes mom and dad cannot be as involved just based on different laws that are in place. So mom and dad can't call a professor and say, hey, my student really needs these accommodations or modifications. They might be able to talk to the inclusive staff, but it really comes down to the student advocating and saying, I really do need this accommodation, and maybe that professor's not providing it, and having a conversation about providing it. There's also options for residential living. At University of Northern Colorado, students have the option to live in the dorms, and the supports in place there really come from a resident assistant as well as peer mentors who are in the dorms. And at UCCS, there are apartments. Their supports often come from students who have the Medicaid or SLS waivers, who might have some outside folks come in and help with things like meal prep or cleaning routines. So those are kind of your different residential options. We are seeing that we've had a couple students come from out of state, and we've had students coming from across the state, which I think is really exciting, because sometimes I know it can be really scary to think about sending a loved one away to a college campus, but we're finding that students are successful. Then the other piece is just with different life skills students are developing. So again, I talked a bit earlier about public transit. Planning outings is a big one. So if you want to go out on Friday night, kind of doing all of those components of where are we meeting? How are we getting there? Are we Ubering? Are we using public transit? How much is it going to cost? And just kind of following through on plans. And then relationships, I think this is a big one with students, is just there's so many different relationships, whether that's a sexual relationship, whether it's dating, whether it's roommate relationships, lots of relationships. So just kind of thinking about all those different pieces that come into talking about independence. I see that we have a question. So it says, just to clarify, the apartments at UCCS are off campus. Um, Kind of. They're on campus, but they are off campus. So they're not like, they are student specific apartments, not run by UCCS. And so the Office of Inclusive Service can answer other questions that you might have about like the specifics of how the apartments work, but that's kind of the difference. My understanding is that UCCS for a long time was more of a commuter school, so the dorms are more limited there. And so students have been in apartments, and I think that's been working out pretty well for them. And in terms of roommates, that's when I always get asked for those apartments. They're kind of random roommates. They could be other people with disabilities. They could be individuals without disabilities. Some of the students at UCCS choose to live in the apartments, often when their families are further away. And then some students at UCCS still do commute to campus. Okay, so if you've got other questions on kind of that general overview, feel free again, put them in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm going to get into the really kind of nitty-gritty with school specifics. So for the admission, a student has to have a documented intellectual or developmental disability. Again, would not traditionally be accepted. I know that sometimes this can be a little confusing what that is. If you're ever in doubt about whether a student would qualify, my suggestion is to reach out to those inclusive service offices directly and just know that there might be more flexibility than with, say, a government program. So I might also hear sometimes from parents that their child has Down syndrome, but they don't have an intellectual or developmental disability, but they do use modifications. So that's kind of a case where maybe one of these labels isn't what's been kind of provided, but maybe this would still be a good fit. The same with autism can be a little tricky. It comes down to whether the student is using those modifications and whether they'd be traditionally accepted. Students also, it really comes down to having a desire to go to college and to work and live as independently as possible. So we really don't want this to be a, hey, come to college, get a t-shirt, and go to a football game. It is much more, hey, come to college, take actual college classes and work towards your career and engage in those career activities, having those internships, having those work experiences to really, again, transition not into another cliff, but to transition into higher paid jobs in different fields than might traditionally be expected. Other pieces, students need to be 18. There is no upper limit. So if the student is older and says, this opportunity didn't exist, I think I'd like to go back. We've definitely seen that. The first year, I think the majority of students were more like in their mid-20s, and I think that was really because these options were not in place. Now, I think we are seeing more students who are younger who are applying, but there's really no upper limit. And so part of it can also be like, when is the student ready and when are they interested? That might not be until they're 22 or 28 or 30 or older. Just consider, if you're going to go to UNC and maybe you're in your 30s and you want to live in the dorms, that might be not as normative. But with the community college especially, there are many students who might not be receiving inclusive services, but who are just older students in general. And then when it comes to transition program, I'd say a lot of the students who are on these pathways qualify for their school district 18 to 21 program. Not all will do the transition program. Some might do a year, some might do 2 years. Again, totally up to the student, what their family thinks, and yeah, it's really kind of up to them in that decision. A lot of people will kind of ask me for like, what's the indicator? When would be the best time? And there's just so many variables. Sometimes, you might say, well, I want to go to UNC and all my friends are going to UNC this year. And that will be more of a support than if I did transition for a year. Sometimes you might say, I have some really concrete things that I need to work on, like using public transit independently or different communication skills. So I'm going to work on those for a couple years in transition. The other piece is students are held to the college code of conduct. And so just when you're thinking about that participation, just know that that is part of what is required for inclusive higher education. And then the last piece for admission is they are applying directly to the inclusive office on campus. So you're not completing the traditional application that university might have. I've put the school contacts here with the links. Again, I'll send out these slides so you'll have that access. This map is showing where students have come from. I talked about this a little earlier, but just getting at really they are coming from across the state. So if you happen to be on this webinar and you're from a different area of the state, um, know that it's feasible. And if families are ever feeling, hesitant and you are a family member or you're a teacher and thinks it'd be helpful for one of the families you work with to talk with someone else about these experiences, sometimes our organization has been able to kind of help facilitate some of those conversations between parents just to know, like, how is it going? How does this work for you all? Then for the financial information, students are paying tuition and fees. Again, students are taking a slightly reduced course load. So what you might see quoted as the traditional tuition rates for school, this will be slightly lower because students are taking less classes and you're paying kind of per credit hour. There is a program fee for inclusive services that is assessed by the school. So if you're at UNC, that's assessed by UNC. Sometimes you might hear that that's like an in fee or that our organization receives that. That is not true. That is really specific to the school and the supports that they're providing. There's also room and board, if applicable. And then there are a variety of different potential financial and community resources that go a little bit beyond what your traditional college student might have access to. And as a side note, if you want to know kind of that specific financial information, you can go to the school websites and some of that's available there, or you can contact them directly. But going into kind of what some of these resources are, there are some scholarships that are disability specific. I am one of those people that often thinks, does anyone ever get scholarships? I don't know. But in this case, it is true. Some of these disability specific ones students are able to access. So for example, there's one called Ruby's Rainbow, and it's for students with Down syndrome. It ranges from $1,000 to $10,000 per year. And we've had 6 students in Colorado this year who have received that scholarship. So I always think it's worth it to look into things like that. College funds and ABLE accounts are another opportunity. I really like the ABLE account. If you're not familiar with them, in essence, it's a way to maintain your Social Security while still saving. So it gives individuals more financial sustainability. If you want to look into it more, you can go to Colorado ABLE. It's either like a .com or a .org, but you'll be able to find it. What's cool with the ABLE accounts is money you save in them can be used for education, but it can also be taken out to be used for medical expenses or any other disability-related expense. And so it's not as tied as a college fund would be. So if you're thinking about younger families, I think ABLE accounts might make more sense than a college savings account if you're not sure if this individual will go on to college or not, because there's no penalty for taking money out of the ABLE account like there would be for a college fund. Something that is newer in Colorado in the last, in the last year is that financial aid is available. So before, you may have heard that students with intellectual disabilities on these pathways could not use financial aid. Each of the schools applied for, UNC and ACC have applied for comprehensive transition program status, which is just a federal designation saying they meet certain criteria, kind of like it talks about how included are students without disabilities, what classes do they have access to, is there an advising program, the certificate we talked about earlier, different pieces. But what it means is that students don't have to meet the traditional financial aid requirements, and so they still can apply for the FAFSA. Under this framework, students are eligible for grants and work study. Work study is basically where you're working on campus and you're getting paid, and you can apply that towards your student bill. Students are not eligible under CTP status for loans. And I don't know that that will change, but that's just kind of what that is. So hopefully this is making sense for financial aid. If, again, you're really thinking, I know a family this would be great for, let me connect them. There is a financial aid counselor at each school who should be familiar with kind of how that works. And again, this is specific for UNC and ACC. UCCS has been in the process of applying, and so we'd hope that they'll also have financial aid available in the coming future. The Division of Vocational Rehabilitation is also another great resource. I think this is great. Whether or not your student is looking at college, DVR can be somewhere to access to talk about what does employment and adulthood look like. Get some of those additional vocational services. In the case where a student may have a career goal that is in alignment with going to college, there also may be some funds available through DVR that is going to be very specific to the family and their financial situation and what that career goal is. But at the bare minimum, I always encourage you to connect with DVR, whether again you're a parent and you're advocating for your student, whether you're a teacher, whoever you are, just so that that family knows that resource is there. And sometimes we'll hear, well, if I go to college, I can't use these resources that other people and other adults with disabilities use. That's not necessarily true. So the same thing with your community center boards. These are your things like developmental pathways or Imagine or North Metro or whatever that might be in your area. And with those Medicaid waivers, there are options to use the different services. So things like using mentorship, things like those independent living skills. It's not necessarily necessary, but if a student is worried about falling off one of these waivers and wants to continue using it, or if they might need some of these services to live independently after college, that's again another great connection to make. And then the same thing, whether they go to college or not, it's something that can be utilized. And then my final note on the financial piece is just research each of the options because it's going to be very individualized. A lot of times people will ask me for what are the specific numbers on different things, and it's just really hard to say because it really depends on a lot of variables. Again, I talked about earlier, the first graduates are coming this spring, so I just have their photos up here. We're really excited because this will be really the first time students with intellectual disabilities have walked across the stage and earned these certificates at the schools that we work with. So they'll be from ACC and UCCS, so you'll see a lot of coverage there. They each kind of are working on looking at what their jobs are going to be. So just like any other college senior, they're kind of engaged in that college search. One student recently secured a position as a CNA with the hospital system. One is looking to move on to a university from the community college level to continue pursuing her education. She kind of decided that inclusive higher education was a place to start, but would like to go the bachelor's degree seeking route. Another has been working with one of the ARC chapters, doing some advocacy work with them, so may stay with them, may look for something different. So really kind of a different range. Another student, she is really interested in teaching American Sign Language, so she's had a few internships with the local school district and is hoping to gain employment within that field. So that's just some examples. Those are my specifics for all of the supports. If you've got questions, again, I can see that chat box, so just let me know what your questions are. And I'm going to move into preparing for college next. So for preparing for college, one of the biggest things that can be done for students with disabilities is just encourage them to dream. I really think that if we started talking to students in elementary school about going to college, that we would see a lot different outcomes for our students because they'd really have that high expectation for what's possible for themselves and kind of what other people think can happen for them. Another piece with this is just talking about the disability. It doesn't have to be a negative. It can just be, my disability impacts me in this way. These are the things that I need. And also, here are some of my strengths that I can contribute because I have this disability. Sometimes students that I'll talk to might not really be able to articulate what those needs are or what their disability is, but having that articulation is really helpful for getting the services they need when it comes time to advocate for themselves on that college campus and then kind of for the rest of their life. Another piece with this independence in terms of preparing for higher education is learning from failure. For parents who might be on the line, sometimes it is okay for your student to fail and to learn from those mistakes. An example that I always use is like, if you get locked out of the house, that's something that can happen. You can get locked out of your dorm room at college. And so how do you problem solve through that? Or if you accidentally mix all your red clothes with all your white clothes and now everything has turned pink. That is not going to end the world. That is a mistake. But sometimes like having that happen is a way to learn. Like, okay, yep, I know I shouldn't mix my colored clothes with my white clothes in the future. So just think of some of those places where mistakes might happen and they are learning opportunity. Obviously, you don't want to set your student up for complete failure. So like using public transit, you want to make sure they're going to be successful if they're going to use it independently, but just kind of pushing towards that independence, kind of step by step. Inclusion is something else that we talk about. Obviously, we're very passionate about it, as we're always talking about inclusion on college campus. But I think that it's also looking at inclusion just within your life. Are there sports or other activities that you can participate in that will put you with people without disabilities, just to kind of develop some of those skills and learn from other people in those environments? Because when you move on to post-secondary education, you will be in one of those inclusive environments. And there might be less people with disabilities that are around you. So just having those opportunities. I know sometimes this isn't possible with kind of classes. I always say if it is possible, that's really great. But if it's not, look for other opportunities, whether that's like Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or after school clubs or in the lunchroom, whatever it is, to have some of that inclusion happening. The IEP is another place where we can do a lot, I think, around post-secondary and talking about what are some of those goals for the transition process. One piece here is just doing general education with IEP participants. Sometimes, again, those families might not know that these options exist. Or on the reverse, we might have teachers who don't know these options exist. And so sometimes it is parents who are doing a lot of that educating around. This goal might actually be feasible because these supports are in place at these specific schools. If you're not sure, like if you're a teacher and you're wondering what would be some relevant goals, Think College, again, has a lot of really great resources related to developing that IEP around some of those post-secondary goals. Oftentimes I'll get asked what are specific skills that are relevant for higher education. So I have a short list here, and I'm hoping that it'll just show that these skills are maybe a little more broad and maybe more vague than just having academic skills. So it's things like communication skills, sending emails, responding to phone calls, responding to text messages, letting your employer know that you're going to be late or that you're sick or whatever it is. Coordinating a schedule is another one where when you move to the college campus, you're spending a lot less time in class and a lot more time independently, maybe going to work, maybe going to study, different things of that nature. And so just having the ability to coordinate all those different pieces is really helpful. Navigation and travel goes right along with this, having the opportunity to take public transit into your local community, or even just take the bus around. Both UNC and UCCS are pretty big, and so in the winter, it's pretty cold, and it's not great to walk across campus. And so just having some of those skills to be able to generalize to using different forms of transit and just navigating what the campus looks like. Oftentimes for freshmen, there will be a lot of additional support with peer mentors, with helping to find those classes, meeting up with people, things of that nature. But the more that you can do kind of before they get there is really helpful. Money transactions, similarly, students are going to be more independent. So having that ability, if it's getting quarters from the laundry machine or depositing a pay stub or whatever those different pieces are. And then the last one is using technology. This can be for things like reminders to take medication. It can be just for like using Google Calendar, or it can be more like technology that's assisting you within the classroom, like we talked about earlier with different assistive technology devices. Then my last kind of takeaway for preparing for college is just finding the right college. So we can talk all day about what are these specific supports, but really, I would be the most boring person for a student to talk to about a potential college because I don't know all of the nuances of what it's really like to be a student there. I can't really talk to you about what is the dining hall food like. I don't know as much about what the dorms are like, but those are things that students really do need to consider and have every right to consider like any other student. Our vision is really that these options would exist on all college campuses, but I do think it's still great that we have 3 schools that students can choose from within our state. So if you're working with a student or you have a student in your life, just think about what can you do to help them explore these college campuses. If you know that this is the type of support they need, can you go take a tour? Is there a high school counselor who works with all the other high school students to talk about what college might look like? Are there college fairs where you can ask questions? Those individuals might not be as well versed in what these specific inclusive higher education supports look like, but they are often the individuals who can answer your questions like, Does this school have a ski club? Because that's something I don't know about some of these schools. So just again, thinking just about how do you explore a college and make sure that it feels like a good fit for you beyond just having the support that you need. I've put together this slide to talk about how you can help. One of the things is just asking questions. So there's still a lot that folks don't know about inclusive higher education, and that's okay. Our organization or the schools, we're happy to answer questions you have. So if you're ever in doubt and you think, I still don't really understand how the career piece works. Or can you talk to me about like how do I make sure my student is going to be safe living on campus? Any kind of doubts, hesitations you have, if you hear something that you're like, I thought that's not true. So often with like financial aid, like we know financial aid is now available at UNC and ACC. So if you're hearing people who are saying financial aid's not available, those are all things that we're happy to help address and just kind of answer questions around. Along with this is informing others of the options. We're really hoping, that's really my hope, that we start reaching younger families so that they have more time to prepare and know these options exist. Other school professionals, so we talked about high school counselors. If you're in a high school setting and can talk to counselors so that they know it's an option, because sometimes special education professionals, they're not going to know everything about what's going on at a college campus, you know? So kind of helping to bridge, like some people have this resource, some people have this resource, just letting everyone know what's available. I've linked to our social media, and I also have a link if you'd be interested in signing up for our newsletter. So when you get a follow-up email from me after this webinar, those will be there if you're interested. And those really do help. We'll hear from families, probably every month I hear from a family who says, wow, I never knew this existed and I just stumbled upon it on Google, or I heard about it in the news or something of that nature. So that's really helpful, especially for reaching areas of the state that maybe aren't as populated. My takeaway point is that together we can define what's possible for students with disabilities. You really do have, I think, potential to help raise the expectation for students and really help them achieve some of their dreams as it comes to college and their careers. My contact info is listed. So again, I'm Shelby. I do our outreach. Um, I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. I want to just thank you for taking your time out of your day to be here for this webinar. It was really exciting just to see everyone that had signed up and is interested in learning more. And if you know, it's days from now or weeks or months from now and you think, oh, I still have a question, again, please don't hesitate to reach out. That is something that I'm more than happy to help with. Okay, so otherwise, if you want to get off, you're free to get off, and then I'll just be around answering questions. Thanks, Carol. Have a good day. What the name of the different offices are. I sure can. Let me go back and I'll just stay on that slide. That's probably more helpful. Here you go. So you have the goal at University of Northern Colorado, Elevate at Arapahoe Community College, and Office of Inclusive Services at University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Good question, Kate. Thank you for asking that. Okay, well, thank you all again for attending. I will send these slides out slightly later today or tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.